Time for our monthly What is Written study, and we'll get right to our first question. And it is, when did Jesus cleanse the temple? I hope you remember that I recently preached on Jesus' cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. But there was an aspect of that I didn't have time to talk about, and I want to talk about it with you this morning. Because there's a bit of a problem, at least in the minds of some, because John in his gospel places a cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. But the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place a cleansing of the temple at the end. I'm not going to take the time to read John's account, but I would invite you to turn to Mark chapter 11, and let's read Mark's account as representative of the synoptic gospels, beginning in verses 15 and following. So they came to Jerusalem. Then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." So, John places the cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. The synoptic gospels place it at the end. And so how do we explain this? Well, the simplest, the easiest, and I believe the correct explanation is that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. How many of you already believed that Jesus cleansed the temple twice? Most of you believe that. My question for you to chew on is why? Why do you believe that? And that's what we'll be talking about. But one explanation is that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, once at the beginning of his ministry, and John tells us about that cleansing in his gospel. And then Jesus cleansed it a second time at the end of his public ministry, and the synoptic gospels tell us about that. You may be surprised to know, however, that many scholars argue that Jesus cleansed the temple only once. And that means that either someone, either John or the synoptic gospel writers, made a mistake. They got it wrong. Either John or the synoptic writers put this cleansing in the wrong place. Or, and this would be the popular view, a deliberate relocation was made. Scholars believe that John really knew that Jesus cleansed the temple only once at the end of his public ministry, but he deliberately moved that forward to the beginning of Jesus' ministry for theological reasons. Andreas Kostenberger says, the majority of commentators consider this to be an instance where John rearranges synoptic material. Now, Kostenberger doesn't believe that that's what happened, but I'm showing you this quotation to just give you some evidence that the majority of commentators think only one cleansing, and John deliberately relocated it in his account. Grant Osborne says much the same thing. The majority of scholars, and he lists a few, believe that there was only one clearing of the temple at the close of Jesus' ministry which then became a major factor in his arrest. Thus, they think John took it out of order and placed it at the start of Jesus' ministry for thematic reasons. I don't know if any of you were familiar with this or not, but perhaps we need to ask the question, why is this important? Some of you may be sitting there thinking, who cares? Why are we talking about this? Well, it's important because skeptics and critics of the Bible claim that this is a clear contradiction. And they argue we can't trust the Bible because of all the contradictions found therein. That's their claim. And they would cite this as one example. Then, as I've already mentioned, many scholars claim that John deliberately relocated this incident for theological reasons. Let me just quickly point out that there's no indication of this in the text. And then secondly, I would ask the question, would John have played fast and loose with his account? Does this call into question his honesty? Well, I must tell you that I think it does. If John deliberately relocated this incident, can we trust anything else that John tells us in his gospel? Well, let me present some arguments for two cleansings. And this is what I believe occurred. First of all, the accounts, John's account and the account in the Synoptic Gospels, are too different to refer to the same event. We'll talk about those differences in just a moment. In the second place, an earlier cleansing fits John's narration. And I'll explain more about what I mean there in a moment as well. And then in John's account, Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And his listeners responded by saying that it had taken 46 years to build the temple. Well, I believe that statement fits an earlier date rather than a later date. And I'll explain why I say that momentarily. Furthermore, two cleansings better explain the testimony, put that in quotation marks, during Jesus' trials, because reference to destroying the temple comes up in Jesus' Jewish trials. The accounts in John and the Synoptic Gospels are different in many ways. As I have already said, John places it at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. The Synoptics put it at the end. John tells us that Jesus made a whip of cords. That's not mentioned in the Synoptics. John tells us that Jesus drove out the sellers and the animals, the oxen, the sheep, and the doves. The Synoptics tell us that he drove out the buyers and the sellers. John tells us that Jesus poured out the money. That's not mentioned in the Synoptic account. Both John and the Synoptics mention that Jesus overturned the tables, but only the Synoptics tell us that Jesus overturned the seats of those who sold doves. It's only in John's account that Jesus says, take these things away. And it's only in Mark's account that we are told that Jesus forbid them to carry their wares through the temple. In John's account, Jesus refers to the temple as my Father's house. The synoptics refer to it as my house. Only the synoptics describe the temple as a house of prayer. John describes it, or Jesus in John's account rather, describes it as a house of merchandise. The synoptics describe it as a den of thieves. And then, in John's account, reference is made to Psalm 69 verse 9, but in the synoptic accounts, reference is made to Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah 7 verse 11. Psalm 69:9 reads, because zeal for your house has eaten me up, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. But Isaiah 56:7 reads, even them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And then in Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 11, the text says, has this house which is called by my name become a den of thieves in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, says the Lord. It is only in John's account that Jesus made the statement, destroy this temple and I'll build it up again. Only in John's account is reference made to the 46 years that it took to build the temple. It is in John's account that the writer explains what Jesus meant, that he was talking about the temple of his body. And John tells us that later, after the resurrection, Jesus' disciples remembered this statement and they believed the Scriptures and Jesus' words. And then John goes on to tell us that during that Passover feast, many believed in Jesus because of the signs that he performed, but Jesus did not commit himself to them. I hope you can see that while there certainly are similarities in John's account and the account by the synoptics, there are some significant differences. Furthermore, an earlier cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry fits John's narrative. Now turn in your New Testaments to John chapter 2, because we want to look at a few verses in this portion of the New Testament. John tells us in John chapter 2 and in verse 13, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And then John gives us his account of Jesus cleansing the temple. And as I just mentioned, John tells us that during this Passover feast, many believed in Jesus' name because of the signs he did. And then in chapter 3, John tells us about Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night, acknowledging him to be a man sent by God because of the signs he did. What signs were those? Well, the signs that he performed during the Passover feast. And then in John chapter 3 and in verse 22, John says, after these things. What things? Well, the things he's just been talking about. Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he remained with them and baptized. And then in chapter 4 and in verse 3, John says of Jesus, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. And the next verse tells us that he traveled through Samaria. And then the next several verses tell us that at Jacob's well in Sychar, Jesus teaches the Samaritan woman. And then look at John chapter 4 and verse 43. Now, after the 2 days, that's the 2 days he spent with the Samaritans, he departed from there and went to Galilee. Now look at verse 45. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they also had gone to the feast. What feast is he talking about? He's talking about the Passover feast. And it was at that time when Jesus cleansed the temple. Many came to have faith because of the signs he performed. Nicodemus believed he was a man sent from God because of the signs he performed. What I hope you see is that all of this is pretty tightly connected together. Therefore, an earlier cleansing of the temple fits John's narrative. Now, what about that statement that the Jews made to Jesus in John 2 and verse 20 when they said to him, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" Well, historians tell us that Herod the Great began to reign in 37 BC. And he began reconstruction on the temple in the 18th year of his reign. That would work out to be 20 to 19 BC. Well, the 46th year from that brings us, at least according to William Hendrickson, to AD 27 or 28. Work on the temple continued until 63 or 64. But here's my point. The date, AD 27 or 28, fits the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, not the end. Are you with me? Are you following what I'm saying? What I'm trying to show you is that there's good reason to believe that John didn't relocate this cleansing. That the cleansing that John talks about occurred near the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Now, reference to Jesus destroying the temple comes up in the Jewish trials of Jesus. Turn in your New Testaments to Mark chapter 14 and begin reading with me at verse 55. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. And now verse 57 and 58, then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But Mark tells us in verse 59 that their testimony did not agree. Now, I want you to notice that during the trial, these false witnesses misquote Jesus. In other words, Jesus did not say what they said he said. In John chapter 2 and verse 19, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But in Mark's account, these witnesses say, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" Now, do you see a difference? There's a difference between what they claimed Jesus said and what Jesus actually said. I would suggest to you that it's more likely that they misquote something that Jesus had said a few years earlier rather than a few days earlier. You see, Jesus, according to the synoptics, cleansed the temple on Monday of Passion Week, and he is tried on Friday. It's more likely that they would misquote Jesus if it was something that he had said 2 or 3 years earlier rather than just a few days earlier. Two cleansing of the temple are certainly not improbable. Jesus went to Jerusalem several times, and two cleansings of the temple was the majority view in antiquity. The view of Origen, Chrysostom, Augustine. It was the majority view during the medieval and Reformation eras. The view held by Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, Martin Luther. Now, none of this proves anything. I understand that. I want you to know that I understand that. But what I'm suggesting, it's interesting to me that this was the most ancient view out there. Two cleansings is the view of conservative scholars like Leon Morris, D.A. Carson, Kostenberger, and others. But one cleansing is the critical view today and the majority view among commentators. Is there a lesson here for us? Well, commentators can be wrong. So what are the arguments for one cleansing? Now, you all know I don't think that's the correct view, right? Have I made myself clear enough there? So why do the majority of commentators believe that there was only one cleansing? I must confess to you, I really don't understand why they believe that in light of the evidence that I presented to you this morning. But they do. So one of the things that they point out is that John often arranged events theologically or topically rather than chronologically. And they cite the raising of Lazarus and some of the long discourses in the Gospel of John. But may I point out to you that the scholars who take this view don't agree among themselves about what these reasons were for John's alleged relocation. They point out that there are similar details in the accounts. In John's account, the synoptic account, it occurs at Passover time. It occurs in the temple. All the accounts talk about sellers and money changers. All the accounts talk about Jesus driving out the sellers. All of the accounts talk about Jesus overturning the tables. So yes, there are similarities in these various accounts. They argue that the different wording in the accounts could just be a variation in reporting or paraphrasing. And while that might be possible, that doesn't mean that it's probable or certain. And so those who take this view basically argue that the accounts are too similar to be two different events. Well, I hope that you can see that while there are similarities, there are several differences in the accounts. And then they argue, well, if Jesus had cleansed the temple early, he would have been killed sooner. In other words, the Jewish leaders wouldn't have let him get by with that. And if he had cleansed the temple earlier, he would not have been given the opportunity to cleanse the temple twice. May I point out to you that Jesus made at least a few trips to Jerusalem to participate in various Jewish feasts during his public ministry. And during those visits, he didn't do anything as far as cleansing the temple is concerned. They argue that it would have been a stronger narrative logic for there to be only one climactic cleansing at the end. Let me point out to you that Jesus was not immediately arrested after cleansing the temple during Passion Week. Because afterwards, he returned to the temple during that week. Well, folks, that's what I had for you about that. I think there are good reasons to believe that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. Once at the beginning, John tells us about that. Once at the end, and the Synoptic Gospels tell us about that. Let me mention that John's account of the cleansing occurs in a large block of non-synoptic material. John chapter 1 through chapter 5 largely contains material that the synoptic gospels do not talk about. Now, there are some references in those first 5 chapters to John the Baptist. And the synoptic gospels certainly talk about John's ministry. But the references in John's gospel, while alluding to things that we learn from the synoptics, his references to John are different in many ways. Well, I don't have time for another question this morning. Thank you for your very kind attention. Certainly, as is always the case, if there's something that you didn't understand, if there's something that I need to clarify, I will be most happy to do that, most happy to talk with you one-on-one. Again, thank you for your very kind attention.